last panel of the day. And before we get started, I've been asked to remind everyone that the organizers would love to have you scan the QR code in the middle of your table. It's on a little stand there, and fill out an evaluation. That's going to help them plan future events. So we are going to be talking about nutrition, about innovation, and about food system integration. So this is kind of off the farm stuff and outside the marketplace stuff. So to some extent, not all, but some. So my name is Mary Hendrickson. I'm a professor of rural sociology here at the University of Missouri. I've had a long background in local food systems and sustainable ag work. And I've also spent a lot of time thinking about competition and consolidation in the ag and food system. So that's always something that comes to top of mind. But we have a great panel of folks today, and I'm going to start on that end. So first, we will hear from Erin Meier. She's the director of Greenland's Blue Waters, which is a collaborative initiative for the Upper Mississippi River Basin. Then we will hear from Amanda Dwikarina. She's a graduate student or postdoc. Just graduated here at MU, PhD. That's a big accomplishment. Congratulations. Woohoo. And then Kate Nelson, who is a fairly recent transplant from Kansas State, and we're happy to have her. She's a human and environmental geographer here at the University of Missouri who does landscape processes. And then Colin Cureton, who has two hats, one as a Midwest Hazelnuts hybrid hazelnuts to market, and then also leads commercializations for the Forever Green Initiative up in Minnesota. So the way we're going to lay this panel out, we're going to spend a little bit of time with each panelist at the beginning, and some of them have slides, and they're going to take about maybe 5 minutes to further introduce their work. And then I have three pretty broad questions that we're going to try to work through, or at least parts of those, and then we'll do some questions from the audience and from Zoom. So with that, I think Erin is planning to start.
It's working. All right. I've already prepped everybody that I'm going to whip through some slides to introduce Greenland's Blue Waters and kind of the context of the work that we do. And we'll probably preempt some of my answers, and then I'll yield my time back to the panel. I was told 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to walk through this pretty quickly, but let's see if we can advance. No? Are you advancing, Kira, or was that me? Okay. Greenland's Blue Waters. We sit up at the University of Minnesota. We're a self-funded 3-people organization mostly. We focus, like our name says, we were really born out of kind of this shared understanding about 20 years ago about the hypoxia in the Gulf, which we haven't necessarily addressed, but with kind of a call to action on perennializing the row crop agriculture, the hundreds of thousands of acres of row crop monoculture that really does put a lot of nutrients into the river basin. So we really focus on what we call continuous living cover, living roots in the soil as much of the year as possible, especially in the northern states, is so important, and focus our work on kind of a practitioner audience. We're very much about translating what's coming out of university partners, best practices for practice and TA and policy and program engagement. So I want to walk through kind of like where do these people sit that are trying to innovate and implement and integrate? This isn't working. So can you move it forward, Kara? Yeah. So just real quickly, continuous living cover, what we call CLC. We work around these kind of 5 strategic production areas. We're talking about perennial production on the landscape, agroforestry, but broadly, we also work in perennial biomass, perennial forage, well-managed grazing, a lot of focus on new perennial grains, and then the world of rotations and cover crops and winter annuals. Go ahead and advance. Kira. I just want to whip through these. We don't have to talk about this. We know why it's important. We think about CLC as an implementable framework for those that are reaching for the vision of sustainable ag and regenerative ag, all of these benefits to farmland, to landscape and community. Go ahead and advance. So I love this picture, came out of agroforestry work in France, and Savannah Institute uses this a lot. So if you think about row crop agriculture, what can we see on that acreage instead? Perennial forage, alley cropping, silvopasture. We'll always have some annual, crops, but this is the vision that we work towards. Go ahead and advance. We advance. So we really sit in this work of kind of mid-system, identifying the levers for change, and then do work in a number of these areas listed on this slide. Real quickly, I'm going to walk through some of the things that we've done, again, to kind of preempt, like, what do we do in terms of shifting and innovating around communicating to policymakers, program delivery folks, TA, funders. This was, we had engaged a group called Ecotone to do a social return on investment, pulling from literature, mostly from perennial forage as an analog to a perennial landscape. We invest a certain amount of money. These are the kinds of benefits that landscape delivers. Go ahead and advance. This is another infographic showing this journey of that $1 invested, through, like, what do we get from water quality? What happens on farm? What about climate resilience? And I will say on our website, we've got infographics, fact sheets, case studies, all available for your use. Go ahead one more time. We also had SARE PDP to create a CLC 101. So this is our effort to get to those early natural resource professionals. They may not have any knowledge of ag. We know that agencies are bringing on folks with no information. So what's soil health? What is continuous living cover? How do you talk to your farmer constituent about perennializing that landscape? This is a free online course available to anyone through 3 platforms online. Also, part of this, we did a bit of a reach. We got 2 NRCS cooperative agreements. They canceled our last one with the change in administration. But in order to diversify the landscape, we have to have the expertise and the life stories and the experience from lots of different people. So we had put together a mentorship program that we hope to continue. You go ahead. Just really quickly, some other current work we're going to be lifting here in the next 2 years. Exploring community economic development as partners in this kind of work. How do they see and understand perenniality on the landscape? Let's get beyond corn and soybean. What could they do for their farmer partners and also early supply chain partners? The early crop thing is part of something that Colin will probably talk about too, like how do we get everybody to the starting line? Not only the producer, but the TA providers, their farmer membership organizations, the policymakers. So as new crops and systems come online, we can all start in a measured but ramped up way in terms of scaling. And we're also working on the perennial grain kernza. We're continuing some work with Risk Management Agency, getting them data, especially through the Land Institute, to start evaluating products for perennial grains for farmers. Just want to mention really quickly, the Sustainable Ag System program out of USDA NEFA has been a place that we have found a lot of translational work can happen. They sit often at universities, but the commitment is how do we get out of the university and onto the landscape? And you'll see here, listed a number of different ways that we engage: policy recommendations, programmatic outreach. Go ahead, and I think that's about it. The last thing I want to say, Colin is also part of this group, is really talking about value chains, and I think I'll bring this more up in the Q&A. But how are we bringing value to all the people from the producer, out into the supply chain, and in terms of product development and getting something on the shelf in a way that we maintain the kinds of outcomes that we want for these systems. One more is just the outcomes of this working group that we were on around value chain coordination for CLC in the Midwest. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. And who's going next? Is it Amanda? Do you have slides or you don't have slides? Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Amanda Dwikarina. I just graduated last December from School of Natural Resource here from Mizzou. My work is focused on natural product research. I do a lot of chemical profiling, characterizations of bioactive compounds from underutilized species. For my PhD, I work with American elderberry juice. I characterize bioactive compounds in American elderberry to see whether these bioactive compounds can be potentially benefit for human health. Um, I've been involved in natural products research since 2017. And then I think my goal as a natural products chemist is to be able to translate all the scientific knowledge that I learned from the bench to translate it back to the community, farming community, and potentially giving all the informations to all the farming community for diversify their products, creating a new value-added products, and increase the product value potentially. So yeah, that's from my background.
All right. Hello, I'm Kate Nelson. I also do not have slides. I'm an associate professor here in the School of Natural Resources. As Mary mentioned, I was previously at K-State. I've just been here for a year and a half now. My background is actually environmental engineering, and then I got into human environment and geography. And so now I'm in the School of Natural Resources, which makes sense. And my work is really focused on thinking about the connections between land systems and people and communities across kind of these large landscape scales. I have been working, I guess, in agricultural systems since about 2018, so I'm still a newbie. But really focused here on thinking about issues of diversity, of what we're growing, what we're planting, both the composition and sort of the configuration of literally what is on the land surface and how that's impacting things like ecosystem services. But then also if there are relationships between those things and then the health and viability of local rural communities. So some of my other work is also thinking about things like community resilience and persistence over time, access and availability of different types of infrastructure in local and rural communities as well. And so how those things sort of play together. I'll leave it at that.
Test. Okay, I have some slides, definitely too many. So we're gonna skip around, but my name's Colin Cureton and I'm here with a couple hats on that I'll share about. But this is the only microphone I'm gonna hold for the next few months. And I wanted to start a little unconventionally and just share that this wing of this panel is gonna drive back to a place called Minnesota later, today or tomorrow. And I just wanted to mention that it's some really real stuff going on there. And the cool thing about, I'm not from here, I'll stay off my soapbox. But the good thing about democracy is like we don't have to agree. But I just wanted to let you know that you have agroforestry professionals, collaborators, agroforesters, aspiring agroforesters, and agroforestry customers that are in that situation. So, okay, moving on. Thanks. Okay, so back to trees. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so a few topics today. I'm just gonna share that I'm wearing a couple hats in this conversation. I work for a university and I also have a startup. There's a bright line between the two, but they're related. I'm gonna share a little bit about the lessons learned over the last 6 years working for this university platform that's developing new perennial crops. I'm gonna share a little bit about a company very creatively named Midwest Hazelnuts that is growing and deploying hazelnuts in the Midwest. And then I'm just gonna do a quick profile of a product development and launch that we did. And we're gonna move through that in like 5 to 7 minutes. So next slide. So I have a job at the University of Minnesota for a group called the Forever Green Initiative, which is an agricultural innovation platform that's developing new perennial and winter annual crops for continuous living cover. We're kind of like a sibling platform to Greenland's Blue Waters. About 3 years ago, I started to get really impatient and just said, I think we should just go do it. And so the lead hazelnut researcher at the University of Wisconsin called me up and said, do you want to start an agroforestry company with me to move our first generation of selections to market, which I'll tell you about. And I said, sounds like it's going to take a long time, make not a lot of money for a while, and be really difficult. So when do we start? Okay, so these are the different roles I'm wearing today. Next slide. Forever Green is developing 15 new perennial and winter annual crops that span perennial grains and oilseeds, winter annuals, and some woody perennials. I'm not going to dwell here a lot, but if you go to the next slide, again, one more. We have three main pillars of work. We have about 75 scientists that are developing these new crops. We call that technology push. I manage a team that is developing new value chains in partnership with growers and industry. And so we call that our commercialization, adoption, and scaling team. And then we have external partners that are advocating for policy, social, and cultural change around perennial and regenerative agriculture. Next slide. So we have these multidisciplinary teams developing those crops. And we really sometimes we're like part of the university, but we operate with many partners outside of the university. And at times it feels like a movement. And this is what we're up to at Forever Green. Next slide. When you read the literature on like innovation and systems change and scaling, like you see all these images that with like dots and arrows pointing everywhere. If you go to the next slide, there's all these bodies of research that are called all these things in red. But if you go to the next slide, the problem is there's not many practical guides for like how to go do this. Next slide, damn. So what do we do? Next slide. I just wanted to mention there are a lot of frameworks out there for like understanding technology development and innovation. This is actually the Department of Energy's technology to market system they call technology readiness level. We don't really think of crops like technologies very often, but you know, it's kind of like plant breeding, cultivar development, deployment, commercialization, investment. They kind of march down the same path as things like renewable energy, right? So who's heard of this phrase, the valley of death of investment? Has anyone heard of that? I see a couple hands. Okay, the bad news is there's three valleys of death. There's the technology development valley of death, the commercialization valley of death, and then the profitability and scaling valley of death. So the team that I manage mostly lives in this plunging moment when you think you have something from the research teams and you need to put it out into the market. So that little space is where I've lived for the last 7 years. It raised my blood pressure, but it's really interesting work. Next slide. Okay, so for the last 5-6 years, the two main crops that I spent a lot of time on, learning a lot of lessons, were Kernza perennial grain and winter camelina. I'm not going to say much about them because we don't have time, but I learned a lot of lessons from these two crops. One is really like a perennial, regenerative, high-value food product, and the other is largely used as a renewable fuel feedstock for renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. Next slide. So we're going to just tick down a few lessons learned. The first is that, surprise, legacy food and ag corporations, like, don't mean to disrespect anyone, but like rarely are they driving innovation and the change, right? We know that, right? That is how innovation happens, right? What I observed from this process of like commercializing Kernza was that farmers and entrepreneurs were really driving the change. So right now, if you want to buy Kernza from anywhere in the world, they source it from 6 startup companies. 4 of them are in the upper Midwest, 4 of them are farmer owned. The next thing I realized is that we can develop these de-risking programs, market development programs, but it's really pretty insufficient still. Next slide. Really, entrepreneurs in regenerative ag, many of us among, in this room, are really starved of resources, structure, support, and capital. And what that does is hinders innovation in the transition to perennial agriculture. Keep going. So we can release these crop varieties, de-risk farmer adoption, tell a good story, but without markets, it's kind of for naught, right? So building markets, furthermore, requires skill, leadership, innovation, resources, capital, and sustained effort, and we almost always start too late. The startup game has its own perils. You go out and start raising venture capital money, and it's kind of like over before it starts if you don't think about it a little differently. And then lastly, the opportunity here, though, is still huge. So I've like laid out all these challenges, but I think the opportunity is really large. Maybe with 2 remaining minutes, if that's okay, I'll tell you a little bit about Midwest Hazelnuts. Midwest Hazelnuts is the commercial spinout of a collaborative between Minnesota, University of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Savannah Institute to develop hybrid hazelnut cultivars for the upper Midwest. You go to the next slide. This is a little bit about UMHTI. It's been around since 2007. I won't dwell on it a lot, but we are just the explicit commercial spinout of that group. We heard some about industry development. If you go to the next slide, if we deployed hybrid hazelnuts in the upper Midwest on 20,000 acres, I asked a few people last night, does that sound wild? And they were like, no, that's like to get to a commercially productive region that could compete with other regions. It's about a new $1 billion perennial specialty crop opportunity in a region where we have no nut crop in Minnesota and Wisconsin, right? So moving ahead to the next slide, I wanted to mention that Midwest Hazelnuts is a steward-owned company. Has anyone ever heard of steward ownership? No? Okay. So it's a legal structure that just, it separates voting and economic rights and protects our long-term mission from outside investor control. We still take investment. We're excited to partner with anyone here. But we have a legal structure that protects our long-term mission, agroforestry being a long-term game. And so we've separated between those who are running the business. My business partner, Jason Fischbach, is the lead hazelnut researcher at Wisconsin. He has half of the voting rights in the business, but none of the economic rights. So he's protecting his job. He's not making money off this company, but he has a say in what happens to the technology that he helped develop, right? So this could be a useful model, I think, for people that are developing new cultivars. If Ron or Brian I talked to the other night, like you could be involved in these businesses without having to have that, economic stake in them. Next slide. So in our phase one, we are really focusing on selling plants. We're kind of like glorified plant salesmen at the moment. That's really important to put out high quality genetics. Talk about that in a minute. We'll have a line of business in installing and managing agroforestry and doing some custom harvest. Next slide. So the key thing is that Midwest Hazelnuts is licensing and deploying through nursery partners the UMHDI Adventure Series. The Adventure Series are hot off the presses. They yield on average about 1,000 pounds of kernel per acre, where the hybrid genetics you can get broadly from current nursery partners in that region have the occasional standout plant, but yield like 300 to 400 pounds of kernel per acre. So what that does is transitions this from a mainly hobby industry to a commercial opportunity. Go to the next slide. These are the names of the Adventure Series. I think we can skip ahead all the way to the second to last slide just to get this moving. Go ahead. So these are Go First Farms. If you go back one slide, sorry, go back. Yeah. So we're deploying a set of 10 hybrid education, demonstration, aggregation, and early commercial production sites in Minnesota and Wisconsin. These are a picture of a few of them. Go ahead to the second to last slide. One more. And I just wanted to tell this little story about product innovation. So another company I'm involved with called Overstory Ventures, I recruited a food science and innovation expert who lives in Amsterdam. And now all of a sudden this Amsterdam food scientist is collaborating with a grower-owned company called the American Hazelnut Company. And some of their early products are fantastic. I cook with hazelnut oil. It's delicious. It's great. They're mainly selling whole kernel, hazelnut flour, following oil press, and the oil, right? So they were mainly selling ingredients, right? And whole kernel nuts, very low regional supply. And, people were using these in limited ways in kind of baking and snacking applications, right? But in pretty limited amount. So go ahead to the next. So what we did is we got a project with the University of Wisconsin where we got access to global market research databases where we looked at 3,000 different hazelnut products that have been launched all over the world in the last 2 years. Then we zoomed into the area where people eat the most hazelnuts, which is Italy. And we said, what are the trends there? And we zoomed out and we zoomed into the US and we said, okay, what are the trends in US hazelnut product development? And then we developed a customer avatar, which by the way, this is just how the food industry develops products. This is nothing revolutionary, but we don't apply it very much in our area, right? So then we said, who's gonna buy our product? So no, like what's their name? What problem do they have today? That's how the food industry thinks about products they develop and where they'll place them. And we worked on recipes, costing and margins, and branding and visuals. And if you go to the next slide, what that resulted in was concurrently American Hazelnut Company rebranded as Hazel Heart Farms, and we launched a product line called Midwest Munch. 3 varieties. There's a smoky, like barbecue pub mix on the right. I think there's a chocolate coconut hazelnut mix on the left. And what this did was further stretch their supply, way increased their margins, way got their distribution game up and out into more locations and boosted profitability. This is an example of like product innovation that I think agroforestry broadly as we develop these regional, national, and other markets, it's really important that we just like work with the food industry and how they usually think about these things when we get kind of like, we're all going to eat chestnut flour, and I hope we do, right? But we also need to fit products into people's lives as their lives are. I've probably gone way over my time, but that's all for me.
Great, thank you. And I'm a sociologist, so I just really love to embrace the messiness of social and community work. But as you know, we see a lot of diversity and complexity and lots of stress and decision making because of the complications at the farm level. But now you're adding in all of these other levels, and it can be really messy and really fun and interesting. So we're going to spend the next 20, 30 minutes talking a little bit about how you kind of go through this. And I kind of saw Colin and Amanda talking about these product developments and then moving it on into the industry. And then I saw, what are the consequences of that around for communities and landscapes from Kate and Erin. So we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit. So the first question is roughly around, like, how do we really think about translating some of the scientific discoveries that you're doing, that we're seeing at Minnesota and so on, into products and systems that really have the capacity to transform, to change farmer communities? And then we'll talk a little bit about rural communities and so on too. But like, I guess this one is really mostly or first targeted towards Amanda and Colin. So we'll go there about the scientific discoveries, and then we'll come back around to some of their bigger implications.
So, from my perspective as a scientist, I found or I saw a lot of scientific evidence from all the products, natural products that actually hasn't been known as much. Like, for example, for my PhD research, I'm working with American elderberry. I found a lot of chemical compounds that actually benefit as an antiviral for like anti-influenza virals. Or also bioactive compounds that has antioxidant activity and antimicrobials activity. So, but mostly people creating or use the American elderberry just as, and selling it as just as a raw material, creating, or just for like a juice and or jam, making a jam. But also if we can introduce the scientific evidence, these products can actually benefit for your health, that will increase the value of the product you sell. That's basically the goal of my research, and how we're bringing the technology that we have in the lab to the community, and we're trying to support all farming community to increase the value of their products. Well, what that means is that whenever you guys have products that you want to test what kind of chemicals, components in your products, from the raw materials, from the products that you're trying to develop, and also what kind of to the product that you're trying to sell, we can offer you all the analysis. So yeah, that's from my standpoint.
Sure. Okay. So I think building off of that, I think it starts to become a question of, okay, who's going to do it? And what resources and support and structure do they have? And I think there's an abundance of passion. I think we're all very passionate about this work, and having helped, be the silent partner in a couple grower co-ops and other small businesses, and gathering information from them about the barriers they face. Like, they've got the energy, they've got a lot of the information they need. And then a lot of them say, like, I have no resources to do this. I'm starved of, resources and capital. And, capital doesn't like solve everything, but like to move this stuff out into the market for real, I think that's something we have to tackle together, and we have to do it in a way that's, you know, transparent and accountable and doesn't create more problems for ourselves. And I think we need those pathways. So like universities, I don't know if folks are aware of this, but like one of the lines of like revenue that they make is through licensing technologies, right? So whether it's biotech or plants or other things, a lot of things, we could have a philosophical conversation about it, but IP, intellectual property, it's filed on these things, and then they license those, right? And they're banking on royalties coming back from that licensing. And most of the technology commercialization offices at universities are mostly full of good people, but like lawyers who are doing licensing agreements. They are not building companies. They are not necessarily supporting those entrepreneurs. They certainly don't understand the realities of farming. The track record of agricultural technologies going out of universities to market and really making a splash in the world for real is pretty low. A lot of effort. I see some heads nodding here. Hopefully I don't sound crazy, but I think a lot of innovation can happen in how we innovate. Does that make sense? Right? So I think we could have more hands-on support for teams where, you know, they don't just need a technology or more information. They might need a co-founder. They might need a CFO, right? Like, who's going to run the books of this agroforestry installation business you want to build? Who's going to help raise pre-seed and seed and Series A capital, right? So I think those things are like enabling factors to then get whether it's a new crop or information about a crop into a product. It's a whole series of things that universities aren't set up very well to do. They're very good at discovery, knowledge creation, technology creation, but then they need some new models, and that's what I think we can work on together.
Erin and Kate, I'm kind of interested in following that up with kind of how you think about this science and this research going out further and spreading, you know, at the community level and, you know, at the landscape level, and how we really think about what Colin was just saying. How do we think about how this is going to perhaps do good at that level?
Okay, maybe I'll kind of zoom out and zoom back in. One thing that we think about as GLBW with kind of a foot in the academy and a foot in practice, though don't necessarily directly provide services to farmers or really anyone else. We do a lot of systems work with those that are thinking about these systems. But if we zoom out, what is research? Definitely the biophysical and the agronomic and the nutrition. But what about our soil, water, health, climate, you know, ecosystem service? What do we know about early adopters, the social behavioral? Obviously places where you sit, Mary. What do we know about how communities change? What does it look like to apply kind of campaign science, right, to change at the community level? We know more and more about social networks from the academy, about commercial enterprise development. So we think about, you know, research really broadly. And then, you know, how do we affect change and engage and activate intermediaries in the spaces that then affect, you know, if I zoom back in, the farmer. How does the farmer make the decision? How does the farmer continue to be supported? Definitely you want to look at, you know, opportunity costs and supporting them with cost share and the kinds of practices that you might see at the USDA or at a soil water conservation. But how do you really package that and then focus maybe on a specific product? Or if you think about our strategy buckets, okay, agroforestry, what do farmers need individually and collaboratively in co-ops and that kind of thing. So we think a lot about what's that translation. And, you know, even out of these USDA projects, we're putting together, we've talked to a number of stakeholders, mostly about intermediaries. What are the real policy recommendations that we need to see for perenniality on the landscape? And those hit at every level, local, state and federal. What then are the programmatic things that can come out of either an extension or a state agency, again, to support the farmer? Because and then, you know, on the market side, as Colin is saying, like we need the farmer we want the farmer to make the decision to grow the crop that we want. I often think Minnesota has been a leader in public health work. And it's always like, make the healthy choice, the easy choice, right? Like you go to your vending machine and there's a packet of carrots. You know, in my mind, make the perennial crop the choice for the farmer. How do we do that? We have a market We have ongoing support, direct, personal, farmer peer groups. They know who to call in terms of advice for the first year, second year, 10th year. And we are building supply chain opportunities so they can keep growing and have a market and pull these crops onto the landscape, and hopefully generationally support that farm. So some thoughts I have around that.
So this, I think, is a really hard question, at least from this perspective, right? Because there's a lot of things we're talking about here that everybody has known for decades, for generations, right? It's not that we don't know, it's just we have trouble implementing. And some of that is just because of the way that things are structured now and what our like primary realities are. So I don't know that I necessarily have any specific practical recommendations for like, how do you actually translate this and make this work, right? That's like the holy grail. That's what we want. That's what we want to know how to do. But I would maybe kind of take it out, zoom out a little bit and I think one of the major problems here with why it's hard to get traction is that perhaps the outcomes that we're monitoring and the goals that we have within the system itself, right, aren't necessarily structured to reward the types of activities we want to see, right? So if we're going to actually transform the system on its head, we need to be thinking about, well, what is the actual goal of a successful, a diversified agroforestry system or an agricultural system that includes agroforestry? Does it have to do, instead of just with like bulk production or contribution to GDP, maybe it has something to do with nutrition, right? And maybe it's not just caloric content, but it's talking about, the antioxidants and the micronutrients and everything else you get. Or maybe it's something about livelihoods, right? Or supporting your local communities, right? So we can't have good, strong agricultural systems without really having good, strong rural communities that can help support that spouse that needs to work off farm to help make ends meet during those, poor years. So, and of course, changing first, we need to agree on like, what should our goals of the system be? But then like actually changing them that's another thing, right? And some of that's being present, and some of that is having then the scientific research to back it up, and then the marketing. But a lot of it's just community, right? And pulling people together to make that happen. So I don't know. That's a long-winded, unpractical, no real solutions kind of answer.
But it's really interesting. I was struck by Colin's comment. I did a lot of work on local food systems back about 25 years ago. And I spent a lot of time with meat producers who were struggling against a very consolidated system, and they wanted to do alternatives, and they were trying to do that mid-scale. And it really sucks in that mid-scale. It's really hard. And one of the things that I know is that it was really hard to find a manager of a meat plant who understood the farmer's desire for an alternative and that were interested in an alternative themselves, and they knew how to price it. And so they had enough industry background, but they had enough bridging to the farmer perspective and the community perspective. That is really difficult, and it's going to take a lot of communication and I think training and stepping into lots of different spheres. And I think that's what's so interesting about your work, Colin. And then I think it also translates to what Kate was saying is, hey, what are the, how can we think about our goals and at what level we can achieve them and how these goals can complement each other? Because I think we have to talk about nested scales, right? And we know that from ecology, but it's the same thing on the social side. So first of all, I just think this work is hard. And if I'm a farmer, I don't really care about anything but my livelihood in some sense, because I have to. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but then if you're a business owner, it's the same kind of thing. So we in the academy have a little bit more latitude, and sometimes we have to remember that. All right, so we've got we're going to go through, I'm going to kind of combine these questions, these last two questions. Because we talked a little bit about some of the benefits of these kinds of transformations for communities and landscapes, but I want Kate to follow that up a little bit, what some of those benefits could be. And then I want to really get into how do we really think about designing and deploying systems that balance purpose with profit, triple bottom line outcomes, and really move some of these crops into the landscape and consumer markets. Oh my gosh, that is the real question. And that's the one I really want to focus on. But I think I'd like to come back to Kate and think a little bit about, what are kind of some of these benefits or the benefits that you've seen at the community and landscape level of deploying these systems?
Yeah, so I'll talk, I guess, kind of broadly here, and I don't think probably most people here know there's a fairly long history now with work in ecology that's looking at diversity of ecosystems, and finding that when you have more diverse ecosystems, they actually have better ecosystem function. And so the same thing really applies in agricultural systems as well. And there's field scale experiments, but then also things that are looking at kind of like the broader landscape across the US and finding that the more diversity and the more sort of complexity you have in the agricultural system itself and like what is on the land, you tend to have better productivity. And in some cases, because productivity is just one of those goals that we've decided to set our sights on, but there are other ones, right? We're thinking about stability of production over time. We're thinking about resistance to extreme weather events, droughts, extreme rainfall, things like that. When we have in these more diverse sort of landscape structures, we tend to see better overall outcomes in their stability and sustainability. So there's these kind of ecosystem self-reinforcing mechanisms here. And so I would say within thinking about agroforestry systems, whether if you're putting in chestnuts, pecans, elderberries, pawpaws, right? Like, please plant pawpaws for me. Right, when we're adding these things to the landscape, at least we still need more research on this to confirm, but like, there's no reason not to suspect that these would improve ecosystem function as well. And then ultimately perhaps improve your productivity, right? They're going to help with disease resistance, right? If we have too concentrated of areas, we might have disease spread. When we have things that are a little more diverse and scattered pockets, we might have better disease resistance. But then these are also provide benefits to local communities, right? You have potential there to support local communities by having them not reliant on a single or just a handful of different types of commodity crops, right? So support your farmer, provide more stable income for your farmer. It's going to provide better opportunities for your connected communities. And we've seen, there's been a lot of different things happening over time, right? But you've seen through history, like consolidation of farms that's been associated as well with reduction in the number of crops and lack of diversity on the landscapes. It's also been associated with mechanization trends and all sorts of things, but really a hollowing out of rural communities as well. So it's hard to know, did the chicken or the egg come first? But, all indications are if we bring some of that diversity back into the system, right, it'll be good for the community, it'll be good for the land, it'll be good for the operation.
Well, anybody else want to follow up on that?
Check. I guess briefly, I was just going to say, you guys know the benefits of all this stuff. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it. But I just thought it would be a good moment to like lift up this definition of resilience that I've heard or read in the literature that maybe a lot of you have come across. But really, like a lot of times we think, and I think agroforestry fits in very well and importantly to this framing around resilience, that a lot of people think of resilience as like, bouncing back from a shock, right? But that's like the first tier of resilience. And I just had this thought, it's like living like Rocky Balboa, like how hard you can get hit and just keep going. Like that's a lot of growers live that life, and it's not the best way to live, right? It's great if your systems can bounce back because we have all of these increased pressures and shocks. But then in the resilience literature, the second tier that I'm sure many of you know about is adaptation. It's like, how about instead of getting punched in the face repeatedly, you learn how to like bob and weave, right? And so adaptation. So I think trees come into the agroforestry comes into the game, and perennialization and diversification is an adaptation strategy. And then even that third tier of resilience is referred to as transformation, right? And so in order for many agricultural communities around the world to be resilient in their livelihood, I'm sure many have faced this, you realized you had to transform your entire operation or your mindset or your business model, right? So I just wanted to offer that in this moment. And I have a grower partner in Minnesota who used a hockey analogy for why he was planting hazelnuts. And he said, I'm just skating to where I think the puck is going to be in 10 years, right? So I'm doing that now because whoever's coming next, that's where they're going to have to catch this farm. And I thought that was kind of a nice adage.
Well, let's go on in then. Yeah. Let's go on, and I think this is really the heart of it then. So how do we really think about these systems that are, that are balancing these perfect purpose and profits? Like I was really interested in how you've set it up as a steward company. I've heard of, the B Corps that are have a social benefit, and I've heard of the worker owned, but not of the steward companies. So that's really interesting. How do we think about, how you start to build these value chains? How is there fair compensation across the value chain? And near and dear to my heart is always like, where's the power to make fair compensation happen? Because I think that's a big issue. How we think about how we coordinate these value chains and what's the role outside of the food and, the actual, operators. And then, how do we, in some sense, how do we kind of build this ecosystem approach, entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you will? How do we kind of build that? So, kind of the thoughts you guys have on, man, those are immediate issues. And we only have like about 10 minutes to answer before we open up to some questions.
I'll jump in because I was just thinking about some of the value chain, kind of the coordination and considerations around it. I had mentioned that Wallace Center at Winrock, they had gotten a regional food systems planning thing. There's a number of us, Colin has been involved in that, and Savannah Institute and others in the Midwest thinking about value chain coordination. That is a really fluffy term, right? So we kind of know what a supply chain is. And there's a couple different layers that people layer onto the idea of value chains. One is values-based values chains, so that you want to build maybe some kind of ethical or moral outcome into everything from the production to the farm gate to the cleaning and the processing and the aggregating and the product development. The other way to think about it that we have talked about, and I'll say this working group through Wallace also came after the Forever Green Institute or the initiative that Colin had mentioned. There's been a learning and experimentation network, a LEN. It really ended up being kind of a therapy session for, I think, in some ways, for intermediaries, because the intermediaries are really important in any supply chain development, and especially when you start to think about what is a value chain. And one way I often think about it, in addition to this values-based, is that we want to continue to create a democratic engagement that's relationship-based, but that has equitable monetary kind of remuneration for all of those players along that value chain. And that gets really hard, right? Because we want to make sure, from local food systems to sustainable ag, that the farmer makes more money than they've been making in row crop world. So we want to make sure that that value stays center at the farmer, but there are intermediaries making this work happen that are community-based and industry-based. And we have to think about how they're all players in the same sandbox, and we all have to be successful and full people and live good lives. If we want the vision of these food systems that we have and these agricultural landscapes, if we want to really see them realized, we have to be thinking about this full arc of all of these players. And so even though I think we've had a lot of conversation of value change, coordination, all these words for continuous living over in the Midwest. Okay, but it is really important to keep thinking about how do we do this work well? How are we supporting each other? Clustering geographically, clustering around possibly a product or again, a set of strategies is one way to build community that may or may not be geographically based, but it has to be grounded in some way because we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about geographic clustering of work. So just some thoughts about that. I don't know if I really answered it, so I'll pass it on.
Well, there is no one answer, so everybody has to have some thoughts probably.
I think added to the question how we do it, how as at least as a Center for Agroforestry can help support all the farming community is that we providing you with the technology if you somehow decided to diversify your products or trying to understand how you can innovate your products in the long term, we are able to provide you with that with very affordable technologies. One of our collaborator, just for examples, we have a collaborator from California. She is a young entrepreneur. She developed the products, a chocolate, not chocolate-based product, so it's not from chocolate. So she's trying to find an alternative chocolate from different nuts. And we partner with her to find what is the nutrition that is in the nuts. That's one example that all the farming community can try. So we are open to collaborate with you. You can just send us samples, we can help you to find out what's the possible products that you can develop other than just selling the raw material.
So I think that's really important. It's this infrastructure. So Erin was talking about it as an infrastructure in one sense, but here we have the public institution that provides infrastructure in another sense. Any comments on any of this?
Yeah. So I guess we're talking about like, how do we achieve balance, purpose, and profit, as if it's some far off thing that doesn't, and I don't know. I think from what I've heard today, there are probably a good number of you that I think are probably doing a pretty good job of achieving that right now. And the challenge, it seems like, is more, how do we scale this up across the country so that we can achieve all sorts of other benefits? And how do we scale the market and then still retain that? Right. And so I would just like acknowledgement to kudos to everybody who's doing this, right? Already. And I think moving forward, I guess monitoring is always super important. Like sometimes we forget to like, well, what are those things that are actually, if it's purpose and profit, how am I benchmarking that? And then how do I track and make sure that I'm still achieving that in 10 years from now? Not to say that you need to, quantify and datify everything, but having some sort of marker history so that we can track that over time. And even if it's just like sharing stories, right? To make sure that's happening.
Test. Okay. So I guess briefly, a friend and mentor of ours who passed away about a year and a half ago, Dr. Don Wise, I think it was kind of a co-founder visionary around developing Forever Green Initiative. If the question is, okay, how do we share value equitably? The first thing is like, we have to create value, right? And so he would emphasize, you have a spare dollar, he was pouring it into plant breeding. And some people thought that was like almost myopic, but I heard from a few people and also at happy hours and breakfast the other day, it's like, what's going to create, make your industry really viable? And it was like the consistent high yielding cultivars and the propagation methodologies that can get millions of plants to market at an affordable cost. That's where the excitement is. That's going to enable a lot of other things have to happen, but that's step one. And then the next question is like, okay, well, who's going to either own or control the IP around that? And could it be like us instead of some like shadowy other actor? Like, can you put a business model together to go license that IP instead of it goes to someone else and then we can complain all day like we usually do about big bad corporations and whatnot, but like you either have to be responsible for it and do it, or someone else is going to do it. And probably, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, or so the saying goes, right? And then I would say there's business models. Like I'm interested in steward ownership, but there's co-ops, there's B Corps. I think grower co-ops are like a time-honored tradition of how people co-invest and share risk. They de-risk through each other, right? Not by owning everyone else, but by relying on others. That's like a classic, model. And then lastly, I would say like we flashed through it up there, but like as these new industries take root in modeling, say the upper Midwest, hazelnut opportunity, I don't think we max out at 20,000 acres. That's what I think we need to be competitive. But in modeling that, I was like, okay, this is maybe like an aggregate like $1.4 billion opportunity over 15 years aggregate. Half of that is nut production. The other half is like plant sales, input, services, processing, transportation, value added, land value upside. And so similarly, I'm not saying it has to be some utopian, like everybody kumbaya does it together, but like can some subset of us own more of that process together? Because that's how industry does it. They stack value and they tend to do it brick and mortar, exclude, I don't know if I sound too radical up here, but like, even if they're as service enterprises, can we be capturing more of that value together? And that's at dinner the other night with Brian and a few others, we said every time you break off one of these like links in the supply chain, say custom harvest or processing, it's not all that profitable to do on its own. And to justify someone to get out there and do it, it's like you're going to grumble about how much it costs. The person going out is going to grumble about how little they're getting paid to go do it. So each link in the chain doesn't feel very profitable, but when you stack the value, these industries at scale are quite, profitable and valuable. So I think value is generated by like stacking those enterprises, having some creativity about the like legal structure, and then thinking about like, do we have real genetics, IP, and then who is that licensed to? That's.
So I wanted to know if there's any question from the Zoom audience. Is there any questions that are coming up from Zoom?
I gotta find it now. Okay, Robbie Colville asked, how does steward-owned relate or compare to producer-owned cooperatives? For Colin, presumably.
Sure. So, I mean, co-ops take many forms, and also steward ownership takes many forms. I think many of us have probably participated in cooperatives and know that they can be really effective. We also know that, they can, there are challenges running co-ops. Anybody in the room run a co-op? Like there can be, decision-making and leadership by committee can be difficult, et cetera. And so steward ownership is, there's a few different ways to structure it. Sometimes as like legacy companies, like it's that thing Patagonia just did. You ever heard like Patagonia gave away their company to fight, or to promote climate resilience or whatever? What they did is they put their company in ownership of a trust. And the trust is committed to, after they pay all their employees and their investors and their owners and pay all their bills and the excess profits beyond that, they reinvest in their mission. So that's one structure. What we went with was a little more focused on just how economic and voting rights are allocated, because like in a typical LLC, for example, however much money you bring into the business, the standard is like, well, you get that much say in the business. So as soon as you go out to raise capital, even if your blood, sweat, and tears, I don't know, say it gets valued at a couple $100,000, you raise $1 million, all of a sudden you're not in control anymore, right? So just every LLC has an operating agreement where you get to decide what it does. You just have to tool up a little like on your knowledge about and thinking, and there's models out there. There's people that can help. There's groups like Purpose Economy, for example, like it's just one model. And so to answer, to loop back to the question, I mean, cooperative is a specific form of legal structure, right? That I think especially has certain rights and protections in agriculture to talk about price, right? Where in other like legal structures, you can't do that. There's federal regulations around that. But steward ownership for us is a way to stay purpose oriented, but to still have efficient leadership, management, be able to take capital, be able to make moves without, say, consulting 50 members. It can be hard to do in an early stage startup. So I could say more, maybe follow up with the question asker, but.
Well, I think that's an interesting model for the southern part of the Midwest because you guys are in the land of co-ops. We are not as much here in Missouri. So I think that the steward business might be a really interesting model for a lot of folks who are coming from, you know, the southern part of the Midwest. Questions, I want to open it up now for questions from the audience. If folks have ideas or comments about, you know, how you really think about this fair compensation, these value chains. And also if you have questions about health, I think, or nutritional properties, I think we can talk about that as well. Any questions out here? Do I see any questions? Yes.
Hello, I don't know if I missed this, but I'm curious as to why you chose a steward-owned structure versus a cooperative.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit, but it's a better fit for our company. We don't have a broad grower ownership at the moment. But we have the opportunity to bring in also like NGO partners, university partners into the governance structure, which I guess they could, I don't know, can they also join as a co-op? Like usually in agricultural co-ops, the producing members are members, but like this is a way to have cross-sector leadership at the table in governance, which we find is like a long-term benefit. If you're like have a 30-year research effort and a 20-year commercialization effort, having like a legal structure that allows them to talk to each other, we just think is important.
And I mean, you can do this like, I know that Equal Exchange, which is a fair trade organization, has when they started, they said, well, we're going to be worker managed, but we don't have any money. So we're going to get all investors. We'll promise you this much, but you can't say anything about how the company is run. And that's not a cooperative. It's a worker managed company. And so there are these ways. So you could have that same kind of raise capital from somebody. It's not in a cooperative form then, but a farmer managed. So I think the point is we need to be open to, as we think about scaling up or thinking about integrating across the food system, we need to be open to how we can collectively capture that value. And I would just say too, that if you are interested, there's a really great video that More Perfect Union just put out about, it's essentially surge pricing in the grocery industry, but it's the ability of major players to adjust the price they charge different consumers. Now, just think if grocery companies can do that to consumers, and Amazon does this and so on, what are they doing backwards? And then how do we think about, like, even if you get into Amazon, then do you make money, right? So I think that these are the questions about fair compensation that become extremely important. So I encourage you to go look at that video. It's on YouTube, More Perfect Union. And they're really examining Instacart, but it's a proxy for what all of the grocery companies are doing. Other questions? Yes, Mallory.
So this is a question for Colin. We've talked a lot about aggregation and cooperative models throughout the day, and I'm sitting here in Missouri, and I've been on Upper Midwest's website before. I loved your presentation, would have loved so many more details from you, but how viable is that an opportunity for growers in our state? I don't know what the limits to sort of the regional footprint of some of these cooperative, these aggregation movements could be or should be.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'd say is I don't know a lot about the dynamics of your state, so I can't really speak to it. I think Erin could tell you a long and important story about multi-decade organizing efforts that enable a lot of this. So it didn't just happen. It's not just the good luck of a lot of snow that made us decide to work together on this. Like there were concrete sets of farmer leaders and research leaders that came together over multiple decades, and maybe you could tell that story.
Especially, I think getting at is, I mean, we're more akin in some sense to, you know, the kinds of organizing efforts that would work in Tennessee and Northern Arkansas and Kentucky, Oklahoma, which culturally is very different, has very different ideas, embraces different kinds of outcomes, you know, but want to keep farmers part of this.
Make sure that I'm not going to answer her question. Is there anything else you wanted to mention on it? I mean, yeah, why don't you go first?
Okay, I mean, I guess I just say that there are like significant regional cultural differences, and I don't think that we can just like export a model or a, you know, a way of thinking. It's actually a really good book called American Nations. Has anyone read it? It suggests that the main like not divisions but distinctions in the United States are not blue and red or urban and rural, but that there's 9 distinct cultural nations in the US culturally that got laid down by like how migration and immigration happened over a couple hundred years. And so like you can't just take like a upper Midwest sort of co-op model and say like, yeah, we're going to do that in Appalachia or whatever, right? But I think I would maybe challenge back and a little bit say that I think your question was a little bit like what's possible here. And I would say that like the people here determine what's possible.
Testing. Yeah, and I think where you landed too is, and I think it might be different of how culturally, state by state, if we can talk about those being hard and fast borders, is really what do people ask of their institutions? And you know, there is an ethic in Minnesota. I'm from Illinois. I'm from the Chicago area. I've been in Minnesota for over 20 years. And worked in a community development fashion where I really started to see this, how there's an expectation and a claim of individual voices and communities to ask of their institutions. And maybe some of what Colin was talking about is part of how that's activated through the land grant University of Minnesota, not only as extension, but asking more from extension. And so a model developed about 20 some years ago called the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, county-based community partners in partnership with university representatives. Also born out of the Forever Green initiative, and many of the people that created that was the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Ag, because there was an ethic of we want to protect our environment in the state, and we want the land grant university and extension and our state, you know, departments to be serving what we want as a population. And what I found historically in Minnesota is, you know, there's certainly political division, but some of those core values, and I think that's probably similar anywhere, is how do you tap into the core values, but not dilute, oh, we all want clean water? How do you tap into that and say, okay, how do we organize in some kind of geographical way that makes sense in terms of relationships and transportation and product development, and create those kind of peer-to-peer relationships that ask of their institutions to help them build different kinds of mechanisms. Maybe one thing I would say. I get, yeah. All right.
The one comment I would make is that relationships are at the heart of this. And I know this from studying organic in the southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and so on, that where we see people that have pre-existing relationships are willing to invest together. And we see like some really cool nodes of organic production around, say, Buffalo, Missouri. There's a feed mill, there's chicken processing, there's fertilizer. So it has, you kind of snowball out those efforts. And I think that's what you folks are all getting at, is kind of these relationships are really crucial. And I think the difficulty is we don't often see the immediate benefit of them all, and they take time, and you're like, I've got so much to do on the farm. And so we understand that. I think that is, I think we're at time, unless there's any other, we probably have time for one more question from the audience, if there's another question. No more questions? Yeah. Maybe I could get Hannah or Ron to come up and kind of close this out, but we do have another thing about the evaluations, right? And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank a great panel for some really dealing with meaty issues.